Hey everyone, and welcome to another Konoha Reviews, where we review games both new and old on all platforms. If you like the content that I make, then please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a review when it comes out. Today we talk about Sin Episode's Emergence, the sequel to the earlier reviewed Sin that came out in 1998. The original Sin came out in the same year as Half-Life and underwhelmed with sales and critical acclaim, but definitely introduced some new mechanics for that time, including an armor system depending on what body part got hit, and more open-ended levels where certain actions or objectives had consequences in later stages. My big grief with that game was the incredibly boring level design, used over and over and over again. The highlight was the first opening level, and a few rays of hopes here and there sprinkled throughout, but in the end, I just was not really impressed, and did not think that the game held up for its age. But what about its successor, that was released in 2006 and now plays on the Source engine? Well, this was even a bigger flop, and actually resulted in the end of the series, what should have been an episodic experience. Episodic content was being introduced in the gaming industry, but we can still nowadays see that it isn't always a great idea when studios get into financial trouble. Telltale had this, for example, too with The Walking Dead, and Valve even had issues with Half-Life Episode 3, despite of course financially it going better than ever for the company. And thus the end result of Sin Episode's Emergence is a 2 or 2.5 hour campaign that only feels like a prologue and never amounts to anything more. Story-wise, it can definitely be considered as a waste of time, but in some ways I did actually get more enjoyment out of this than the original Sin. Let's take a deep dive into this short and turmoil game. So the original Sin told the story of John R. Blade, that was part of the security force and stood up against a corporation called Syntech that unleashed a virus under the lead of the busty Alexis Sinclair. The sex appeal of this character played a big part in its advertising back in the day, and with Sin Episodes, it is no exception. Though they don't have Alexis on posters or wallpapers making suggestive poses like they did in Part 1, her character model still has all of its focus drawn to her massive tits. I can at least say that she looks a lot more human compared to the plastic doll look that they had in Part 1. It does, however, result in her not really looking that evil, because say what you will about her weird plasticky look in Part 1, she definitely looked like a villain. But here, she just looks like any regular female game character except with a massive chest. In fact, the literally opening cutscene has you waking up an operating table, staring at Sinclair and her breasts right in your face. Now, I'm definitely more of a tits person than an ass person, so no complaints from me, but it did feel very much like they did it on purpose, and shortly after, there's a dream sequence where Sinclair's wearing a super tiny bikini, talking suggestively to Blade, which serves no other purpose than create maybe some screenshots that hopefully will convince some teenage boys to get the game. They still make remarks through the entire game of how hot Sinclair is, but this time around, there isn't that much toilet humor as there is in the first game, meaning it isn't being conveyed as that tongue-in-cheek like the first one did. Anyway, in the opening cutscene, Sinclair and her mobster partner talk about how they have injected you with something that will unleash your true beast, but you will never find out what that is since the game's story never reaches that point. In the first game, there was a part that had you transform into a mutant, so it is likely that they had something planned like this in this story as well. Anyway, soon after, you get rescued from the facility by I honestly forgot her name. JC, your hacker friend from the first game, calls her Rookie. Yeah, she doesn't really leave an impression despite the creators really wanting to make her sexy as well with her G-string showing above her shorts. Her name is Jessica, by the way. I had to look that up actually. That's how much of an impression she left on me. Her voice actor honestly doesn't do a bad job, and the facial expressions used with the Source mod do a great impression, but to me, she was just the orange-haired girl with the pigtails and the guns. Once you get rescued by Jessica, you need to escape the facility where all hell has broken loose. It's a pretty cool short sequence where bodies are flying all over the place and people screaming as the place is falling apart. Then there's a lengthy section of exposition in a car, while Jessica is driving and sending you out at the docks to meet a contact of hers. All this exposition is actually very cool, and I love storytelling like this, where it's nothing but taken in the atmosphere. The city of Freeport has never looked so good, and the Source engine truly brings an awesome looking city to life, with character models looking great and smooth movements. It isn't until 50 minutes in where you actually get your hands on the gun, and I did not mind that one bit, since it's really cool to walk around and just admire the cyberpunk vibes. Then after meeting the contact, the shooting soon starts, and due to the Source engine, it all actually feels really good, mainly because of the super satisfying Ragdoll physics once you have shot someone. Whenever you pull off a headshot, the heads of the enemies explode with a glorious crunch as the chunks of the skull and brain fly all over the place. It honestly never got old throughout the entire game. The bad guys initially are a bit basic with your standard masked goons, but the dock levels are pretty cool and open, and finally have some clear and better level design than the first Sin. You also meet some other enemies, including jetpack troopers, and it's just hilarious to shoot these as their jetpack can go haywire, sending them flying all over the place as they scream or setting them on fire while they are still flying, or even resulting in an explosion. The shooting just feels so much more satisfying than the first game, but I did notice that this game sticks really close to the Half-Life 2 feel, and maybe a bit too close. There are multiple games that are built on the Half-Life 2 Source engine, including Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, and this. But the other two mentioned games really feel quite different, and do a lot of new and unique things despite using the same engine, and the Sin Episodes just doesn't do that. One can even see how some of the environments could have fitted straight into a Half-Life chapter, and it also uses a lot of the same assets and objects from Half-Life 2. In all honesty, I had multiple times throughout this campaign where it felt more like a Half-Life 2 mod than a proper game. But that didn't mean that it wasn't fun though. I had a blast and was having a lot more fun than compared to part 1. It also introduces the shotgun at a certain point, which again is just so lovely to use with the bodies flopping all over the place after you fill them with lead. I will say that these regular encounters against the masked goons does go on for a little bit long, while to where I grew a bit tired of them. It often also sends reinforcements after you've cleared a room, sometimes creating the illusion that the enemies comes in waves. But this might in reality actually not be an illusion, since this game experiments with a system that adjusts the difficulty setting on how you are doing. So if you are breezing through a level, it might actually send in more or tougher enemies at you than were you having trouble with a level. And this happens multiple times, where the game just kept sending enemies over and over again, which felt annoying and cheap. And mind you, these were not the types of sections where you needed to hold out for a couple of minutes as enemies just kept respawning indefinitely. You can adjust how aggressive this AI system alters your difficulty, and also how quickly the game will remind you what you need to do or where to go. If you leave it on the regular stance like I did, the game will remind you every 10 seconds that you should stop wasting time by looking around and head to your objective. Something I found a bit annoying, but luckily didn't happen too often since it can only occur when other NPCs are around. So right when the fighting became a bit monotonous, the game threw me a bone. You get to face off against some mutants as well, which is fun yet again a bit basic. The more fun I had was with the mid-level mutant boss, that's like a big tank that bursts through walls and runs at you while you are dodging and firing at the same time. You then eventually regroup with Jessica, and the final stage of the game is a giant office building held by Syntech. This part is actually a lot of fun, since I love shootouts in office buildings. Whether it's Battlefield 3, Max Payne 3, or this, there's always something satisfying about fighting in an office with all the documents, computers, and particles flying all over the place. Here you also get to face a last new enemy type, which is the machine gunner that is half covered in armor. He takes quite a big punch to take down, but once eliminated, his top half will explode in a bloody mess. There are also some drones that you will need to deal with here, and by now, you've also acquired the third and final weapon, the machine gun. Through multiple sections, you will get accompanied by Jessica, which makes the overall experience a bit more lively, and eventually you scale the building to have your final boss battle on the rooftop. This section, along the ridge of the tall skyscraper, is actually very fun, since more often than not, shot enemies will tumble down into the depths in a very satisfying way. Throughout the story, you will meet Sinclair a couple of times again, but only in a hologram format. The final boss is the same mutant fight you did halfway, but this time in a smaller arena, and then thereafter, you have to deal with an attack chopper that is very clearly using pathing and damage models from Half-Life 2. It's a bit anticlimactic, but it gets the job done. The story ends with Jessica being injected with the virus as well, and then a preview of what the next episode was going to be, which hints at a pretty cool battle amongst the streets of Freeport where mutants and soldiers would fight each other. In all honesty, it's kind of a shame that we never got to see this, because I genuinely believe that they were onto something here, and that it had potential to become an entertaining cyberpunk story. The shooting feels way better than part 1, the graphics are quite decent, and it has overall more story and exposition, which is always a good thing in my book. Critiques are the AI system that can become a bit monotonous with throwing the same type of enemies over and over and over at you again, the lack of voice acting for main character Blade, and it's simply too short and inconclusive to recommend for story lovers. Yet despite all that, I had a good time with the 2.5 hours I picked it up for $5, so I would say money well spent. Also because I knew going in that it would only be a prologue. In the end, Sin Episodes Emergence gets a 6.9. I honestly think it's better than part 1, though admittedly part 1 did do some things that were way newer for its time, whereas Sin Episodes does absolutely nothing new. It just plays way better is all. It's also kind of surprising there's no armor mechanic in this game, since Half-Life 2 does have this, so it must have been easy to implement as well. I do wonder if sometime we will see a fan-made mod, or maybe a reimagining of the Sin story, as it definitely tasted like more.